My name is Elena Moreau, 35 years old. If you asked my family who I was, they wouldn't hesitate. A mistake. Not the kind people say lightly, wrapped in regret or softened with affection. No. In my family, that word carried precision. Intent. Like a verdict that had been discussed, agreed upon, and silently enforced over years of cold dinners and colder expectations. I grew up in a house that looked like it belonged in a magazine. White stone walls overlooking Lake Geneva, tall glass windows that reflected sunsets like paintings, and a dining table long enough to seat people who mattered. Everything in that house had a place. Every object, every routine, every word. Except me. My father, Laurent Moreau, was a man who built empires out of numbers. His private banking network stretched across continents, trusted by billionaires who whispered his name like a guarantee of safety. He believed in control, precision, and legacy. Everything had to lead somewhere measurable, profitable, impressive. My mother, Vivian, believed in something more delicate but equally suffocating: image. She didn't build things, she curated them. Our home, our appearances, our social circles, even our smiles were carefully selected pieces in a living exhibition called the Moreau family. And then there was Camille, my older sister by 3 years, but it often felt like she had lived several lifetimes ahead of me. Camille didn't just meet expectations, she embodied them. Fluent in 3 languages before she turned 16, accepted into the best schools without effort, moving through rooms with a grace that made people stop and admire. She understood the rules of our world instinctively. I never did. Where Camille spoke, I listened. Where she performed, I disappeared. At family gatherings, she was introduced with pride, our daughter, the future diplomat, our brilliant Camille, while I stood slightly behind, offering polite smiles no one truly noticed. If anyone asked about me, the answer was always vague. Elena is exploring her interests. It sounded kind, but it wasn't. It was a placeholder for disappointment. Because my interests had no place in their world. While Camille practiced piano in the sunlit living room, her notes precise and elegant, I sat on the floor of my bedroom surrounded by dismantled electronics. Old laptops, broken routers, wires spilling out like veins. I didn't see junk. I saw systems. Patterns. Possibilities. I liked understanding how things worked. More than that, I liked understanding how they could break. The first time I bypassed a basic security firewall, I was 12 years old. I remember the quiet thrill of it, the way my heart raced not out of fear, but curiosity. It felt like discovering a hidden language no one had bothered to teach me. But when my father found out, he didn't see brilliance. He saw embarrassment. "Do you have any idea how inappropriate this is?" he said, holding the laptop like it was contaminated. "This is not what Moreau daughters do." I tried to explain. I tried to tell him it wasn't about causing harm. It was about understanding, about improving systems, about seeing what others overlooked. He didn't listen. "Computers are tools," he said sharply. "You don't build a life hiding behind them." That was the moment I realized something that would follow me for years. It didn't matter what I understood. It only mattered what they valued. And they didn't value me. My mother handled it differently. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her disappointment came in softer forms, subtle corrections, gentle redirections, quiet comparisons. "Why don't you try something more refined, Elena?" she would say. "Something that reflects who you are meant to be." But I didn't know who I was meant to be. I only knew who I wasn't. I wasn't Camille. And in that house, that meant I was already falling behind. School became my temporary refuge. Not because I fit in, but because it gave me structure outside of my family's expectations. I excelled academically, not out of passion, but necessity. Good grades were the only shield I had against complete dismissal. But even then, it wasn't enough. Because success, in my family, wasn't just about intelligence. It was about alignment, prestige, connections, presentation. And I failed at all three. I didn't care about social circles. I didn't know how to network. I wore the wrong things, said the wrong things, stayed quiet when I should have spoken, and spoke when I should have stayed silent. Camille noticed. Of course she did. She noticed everything. You make it so difficult for them, she told me once, her voice calm but cutting. All they want is for you to try. I am trying, I said. She shook her head slightly, like she was correcting a child. Not in the right way. The right way. That phrase haunted me. Because no matter what I did, it was never the right way. When I got accepted into Oxford, it should have been a turning point. My father called it a step in the right direction. My mother hosted a small gathering to celebrate. Camille smiled in that controlled way of hers, as if acknowledging progress rather than celebrating success. For a brief moment, I thought maybe things would change. Maybe this was my chance to become someone they could finally accept. But even at Oxford, I felt it, the same invisible weight, the same quiet sense that I was playing a role I didn't belong in. While my peers chased careers in law, finance, and politics, I found myself drawn deeper into systems, into code, into the invisible frameworks that held the world together. I spent nights not studying case law, but exploring vulnerabilities. Not writing essays, but building something of my own. Something no one asked me to build. Something no one believed in. And slowly, I began to understand the truth I had been avoiding my entire life. I wasn't failing to meet their expectations. I was rejecting them. But rejection comes with a cost. Because the moment you step outside the path laid out for you, you stop being misunderstood and start being unwanted. Looking back now, I realize the pain wasn't in being different. It was in being seen as less because of it. In every glance, every comment, every carefully chosen word, there was a message my family never had to say out loud. You are not enough. And the worst part? A part of me believed them. For years, I carried that belief quietly, letting it shape how I saw myself, how I moved through the world, how I measured my worth. Until one day, I decided I would rather be nothing in their eyes than someone I wasn't. That decision didn't feel brave at the time. It felt like falling. I left Oxford University in my third year, not because I failed, but because I saw something no one else did. It started as a pattern, small, almost invisible inconsistencies buried deep within a network system I had been analyzing for a research assignment. At first, I thought it was a mistake in the data. Then I thought it was my mistake. But the deeper I looked, the clearer it became. It wasn't an error. It was a vulnerability. A structural flaw embedded in the architecture of interconnected financial and identity systems. Something so fundamental that if exploited at scale, it wouldn't just affect a company or a server. It could collapse trust itself. Banking systems. Medical records. Government databases. Everything tied together. Everything exposed. I remember sitting in the dim glow of my laptop screen at 3 a.m, my heartbeat slow but heavy, as the realization settled into my chest. This wasn't theoretical. It was inevitable. Someone would find it. If they hadn't already. I brought it to my professor the next day, my hands trembling slightly, not from fear of being wrong, but from the weight of being right. He skimmed through my notes, his expression shifting from mild interest to impatience. This is highly speculative, he said, closing the file. You're drawing extreme conclusions from limited data. It's not limited, I insisted. It's hidden. That's the point. If someone builds an exploit around this. Elena, he interrupted, his tone soft but dismissive. You're very intelligent. But intelligence needs direction. You're chasing ghosts. Ghosts. That word followed me out of his office like a shadow. But I didn't stop. I refined my findings. Strengthened the model. Tested simulations over and over again until the outcomes became impossible to ignore. Then I brought it to another professor. Then another. Each time, the same reaction. Polite dismissal. Thinly veiled irritation. subtle concern that I was unraveling. "You're overthinking," one of them told me. "You're catastrophizing," said another. And eventually, the words that cut deeper than all the rest. "You're wasting your potential." I should have stopped there. I should have let it go. But I couldn't. Because once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. So I did what I had always done when the world refused to listen. I went back to the only place I knew, even if it had never truly been home. I called my parents. My mother answered. Her voice was warm, practiced, distant. "Elena, this is unexpected. Is everything all right?" "I need to talk to you," I said. "It's important." There was a pause. Then a shift. "Of course. We're having dinner in an hour. Camille is here as well. You can join us." I almost said no. But something inside me, some fragile, stubborn hope, wanted them to understand. Just this once. The dinner table looked exactly as I remembered. Perfectly arranged. Impeccably timed. Camille sat across from me, composed as always, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. My father listened as I explained. Or at least, he appeared to. I walked them through everything. The vulnerability, the implications, the potential consequences if it were exploited. I spoke carefully at first. Then urgently. Then desperately. Because I could see it happening. The subtle shift in their eyes. From curiosity, to doubt, to something worse. Embarrassment. "You're saying the global system could collapse because of something you found?" My father asked finally, his tone neutral. "Yes," I said. "Not immediately. But eventually. If someone. And you're certain that no one else has noticed this?" Camille interjected, her voice calm, almost curious. "They haven't responded to it," I said. "That's different from not seeing it." She leaned back slightly, studying me. And then she smiled. Not kindly. Not cruelly. Just conclusively. "You're throwing your life away for paranoia." The words landed with quiet precision. My mother sighed softly, as if something delicate had just broken. "Elena," she said gently, "you've always had a tendency to become absorbed in things. But this is not reality. You're scaring yourself." "I'm not scared," I said, my voice steady. "I'm warning you." My father set his glass down. "What you're describing," he said, "is not your responsibility. Even if it were real, which I doubt, this is not your role. You are a student. Focus on finishing your degree." "And then what?" I asked. "Pretend I didn't see it?" "Yes," he said simply. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. Because in that moment, I understood. It didn't matter if I was right. It didn't matter if I was trying to prevent something catastrophic. All that mattered was that I was stepping outside the path they had chosen for me. And that was unacceptable. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just nodded slowly. And something inside me shut down. That night, I packed one suitcase. Not everything. Just enough. Clothes. My laptop. A few notebooks filled with fragmented ideas and unfinished code. I stood in my room for a long time before leaving. Looking at the walls. The window. The life I was supposed to live. Then I walked out. No dramatic goodbye. No tears. Just a quiet departure. I left everything behind, including my last name. Berlin didn't welcome me. It tolerated me. My apartment was small, cramped, barely furnished. The kind of place where the walls felt too close and the nights felt too long. But it was mine. For the first time, I existed without expectations. And for the first time, that terrified me. I worked constantly. Not because I was disciplined, but because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. The rejection, the doubt, the certainty in their voices when they dismissed me. So I buried myself in code. building something from that vulnerability. Not just identifying the flaw, but creating a system that could predict, adapt, and defend against it. Something no one had asked for. Something no one believed in. Weeks turned into months. Money disappeared faster than I expected. Savings turned into calculations. Calculations turned into compromises. And eventually, into necessity. The day I applied for government assistance, I sat in a waiting room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and quiet resignation. People didn't look at each other. They didn't need to. We all knew why we were there. When my number was called, I walked up, handed over my documents, answered questions in a voice that felt like it belonged to someone else. It was approved. Of course it was. I had nothing. The first time I used the vouchers, my hands shook slightly as I handed them to the cashier. Not because of shame, but because of realization. This was it. This was the version of me my family had always predicted. The one who failed. The one who couldn't survive without help. The one who walked away from everything and had nothing to show for it. I took the small bag of groceries and stepped outside into the cold Berlin air. Cars passed. People moved. The world continued, unchanged. And I stood there, holding proof of my fall. The day I used food vouchers for the first time, I realized I had officially become exactly what they feared. A failure. And for the first time, I wondered if they had been right all along. Hunger does something strange to the mind. At first, it whispers. A quiet reminder in the background of your thoughts, easy to ignore if you stay busy enough. But over time, it changes shape. It becomes heavier, louder, not just in your body, but in the way you think, the way you see yourself. It strips away ego. It burns away pride. And what's left is truth. There were days I told myself I was choosing this, that this was sacrifice, that every skipped meal, every sleepless night, every quiet moment of doubt was part of something bigger. But truth doesn't always feel noble. Sometimes, it feels like sitting on a cold floor at 2 in the morning, staring at lines of code that refuse to make sense, while your stomach twists into itself and your hands tremble from exhaustion. I stopped caring about proving them wrong. That kind of motivation is fragile. It depends on the people you're trying to convince. And I had already learned they weren't going to change their minds. Not then. Maybe not ever. So I let that part of me go. The part that needed validation. The part that wanted to walk back into that house one day and finally hear them say, "We were wrong about you." I only cared about finishing what I started. Because somewhere beneath the exhaustion, beneath the doubt, beneath the constant pressure building inside my chest, I still believed I was right. And that belief became the only thing keeping me moving. For months, I lived in silence. Not the peaceful kind. The heavy kind. The kind that presses against your ears until even your own thoughts feel too loud. I stopped answering messages. Stopped checking anything unrelated to my work. Days blurred together until time became meaningless. Morning, night, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was progress. Code. Test. Fail. Fix. Repeat. I coded until my fingers cracked, small lines of dried blood catching against the edges of my keyboard. I wrapped them in cheap bandages and kept going. Pain became background noise, something distant and irrelevant compared to the urgency in my mind. Sleep was inconsistent. Sometimes I collapsed for a few hours without realizing it, waking up disoriented, my body stiff from the hard floor. Other times, I stayed awake for nearly 2 days straight, running simulations over and over, chasing something I could almost reach but never quite grasp. And then there were the mornings, if you could call them that. The moments when I opened my eyes and immediately felt it, the weight in my chest. Heavy. Suffocating. Like something was pressing down on me from the inside. Anxiety. Not sharp. Not dramatic. Just constant. A quiet, persistent pressure that made breathing feel like work. There were times I sat there, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember why I was doing this. trying to reconnect with a version of myself who had been so certain, so driven. Sometimes I found her. Other times, I didn't. Sometimes, I cried. Not loudly. Not in a way anyone would hear. Just silent tears that came without warning, slipping down my face as I stared at my screen. Not because I was poor. Not because I was tired. But because somewhere deep inside, there was still a part of me that hadn't let go. A small, fragile part that still wanted something I had spent my whole life chasing. Approval. Not from the world. Not from strangers. From them. My family. I hated that part of me. Because it made everything harder. It made every memory sharper. Every dismissal heavier. Every word they had ever said replayed itself in my mind at the worst possible moments. You're wasting your potential. This isn't what you're meant for. You're not thinking realistically. You're embarrassing yourself. I tried to drown those voices out with logic, with data, with progress, but they were persistent. Because they didn't come from outside anymore. They came from me. That was the real danger. Not that they didn't believe in me, but that, somewhere along the way, I had started to believe them. There was one night, I don't remember exactly when everything almost broke. I had been working for nearly 30 hours straight, chasing a flaw in my own system. Something wasn't aligning. The predictive model kept collapsing under certain variables, and no matter how many times I adjusted it, it failed. Again, and again, and again. At some point, I just stopped. My hands hovered over the keyboard, then slowly dropped into my lap. I stared at the screen, at the code, at the thing I had built. And for the first time since I started, I felt nothing. No urgency, no belief, no purpose, just emptiness. A quiet, hollow realization that maybe this was all pointless. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had left everything behind. For nothing. The room felt smaller that night. The walls closer. The air heavier. I remember standing up, pacing once, twice, then stopping in the middle of the room, my chest tightening as the thought spiraled. What if this doesn't work? What if I'm wrong? What if I've wasted years of my life chasing something that doesn't exist? What if I go back, and they look at me the same way? Or worse, what if they don't even look at me at all? I sank back down onto the floor, pulling my knees toward my chest, pressing my forehead against them. And for a moment, I let myself feel it. All of it. The doubt, the fear, the loneliness, the quiet, unbearable weight of having no one to turn to. No one to tell me I was doing the right thing. No one to tell me to keep going. No one but me. And that was when I understood something. Something simple. Something brutal. If I stopped, there would be no one coming to pick me up. No one would step in. No one would fix this for me. I had already left. There was no going back to who I was before. No returning to that version of my life. This was it. This was everything. So I wiped my face with the back of my hand, pushed myself up off the floor, and walked back to my desk. Not because I felt strong. Not because I felt confident. But because I had no other choice. That was the moment something changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would make a good story. But quietly. Permanently. I stopped waiting for it to feel meaningful. I stopped needing it to feel important. I stopped needing it to feel anything at all. I just kept going. Because survival doesn't care about motivation. It only cares about persistence. That small part of me, the one that still wanted approval, still hoped for recognition, still carried the weight of everything I had been told. I didn't destroy it. I couldn't. But I buried it. Deep enough that it stopped interfering. Deep enough that it couldn't reach me when I needed to focus. That was the part that hurt the most. The part one had to kill to survive. And in its place, something colder took root. Something quieter. Something that didn't need to be seen. To exist. The world doesn't notice you when you're quiet. That's its greatest weakness. Noise attracts attention. Visibility invites scrutiny. But silence slips through systems unnoticed, unchallenged, underestimated. And for the first time in my life, being underestimated wasn't a disadvantage. It was leverage. I stopped trying to convince anyone my work mattered. I let the work prove it. The system I had been building, what started as a desperate attempt to patch a vulnerability, began evolving into something else entirely. It wasn't just defense anymore. It was anticipation, prediction, a living architecture that learned patterns faster than any human team could respond. It watched. It adapted. It acted before damage could happen. At first, it was crude, unstable. I tested it on simulated environments, feeding it data, breaking it, rebuilding it, watching how it responded under pressure. Each failure refined it. Each flaw taught it something new. And slowly, it began to work. Not perfectly, but consistently. That was enough. The first time I deployed a limited version of it into a real system, I didn't tell anyone who I was. I didn't attach my name. I didn't even attach a company. I sent a proposal under a single identifier. E. Moreau. No first name. No background. No history. Just results. The institution I contacted, a mid-sized financial firm in Eastern Europe, had been experiencing repeated intrusion attempts. Nothing catastrophic yet, but enough to make them nervous. Enough to make them listen to something unconventional. They were skeptical. Of course they were. An anonymous proposal offering a system that claimed near-perfect predictive defense? It sounded like a scam. But desperation makes people curious. They agreed to a trial. 30 days. Limited access. Minimal trust. That was all I needed. The first week, the system detected minor anomalies, probing attempts, harmless on their own, but part of a larger pattern no one else had noticed. It flagged them, adapted, reinforced weak points before they could be exploited. The second week, it identified a coordinated attempt targeting multiple entry points simultaneously. It stopped it before it began. Not after. Before. By the third week, the tone of their emails changed. From cautious, to interested, to urgent. What exactly is this system? Who are you? How soon can we expand implementation? I didn't answer the last question immediately. Not because I couldn't, but because I needed to understand something first. Control. I had spent my entire life being told what I should be, how I should act, what path I should follow. This was the first thing that was entirely mine. So I set the terms. No public disclosure. No identity. All communication through encrypted channels. They agreed. Not because they trusted me, but because the system worked. That was the beginning. From there, it spread quietly. One client led to another. A bank recommended it to a partner. A partner introduced it to a larger institution. Each time, the pattern repeated. Skepticism, trial, results, dependence. I never met them. Never showed my face. Never gave them anything beyond what they needed to know. They didn't know who I was. They only knew what I could do. And in their world, that was enough. Months turned into years. The system grew more complex, more refined, more powerful. I expanded its capabilities, integrating machine learning models that allowed it to evolve independently, to recognize threats not yet documented, to anticipate methods that hadn't been used before. It became something people couldn't fully understand, which made it something they couldn't replace. Governments began to take notice. Carefully at first. Quiet inquiries. Indirect contacts. They didn't like what they couldn't control. But they liked vulnerability even less. So they approached the same way everyone else had. Through results. I worked with them under stricter conditions. More layers of anonymity. More distance. Always the same rule. No identity. just the name. E. Moreau. A ghost. A myth. A presence in systems no one could trace. The media began to pick up fragments. Speculation articles. Who is behind the most advanced cyber defense system in Europe? Is E. Moreau a person or a collective? Why does no one know their identity? The more they searched, the less they found. Because there was nothing to find. I had built everything to be invisible. No public records tied to the system. No interviews. No photographs. Even my voice, when absolutely necessary, passed through filters, altered just enough to remove anything recognizable. I became an absence. And strangely, that felt safer than anything I had ever known. Because for once, I wasn't being judged. Not for how I looked. Not for how I spoke. Not for whether I fit into someone else's expectations. Only for what I created. And what I created mattered. The company grew without ever feeling like one. No office. No headquarters. Just distributed teams, carefully selected, compartmentalized, each one seeing only a fraction of the whole. I learned to trust slowly, strategically, building a network that functioned without ever exposing its core. Without ever exposing me. Money came gradually. Then suddenly. At first, it was enough to cover costs. Then enough to stabilize. Then enough to expand. And eventually, enough that I stopped checking. But my life didn't change. Not on the surface. I stayed in the same apartment longer than I needed to. Kept the same routines. Wore the same kind of clothes. A quiet existence that didn't reflect what was growing behind it. Because visibility wasn't the goal. Control was. And control required distance. But there was one place that distance never reached. My family. Years passed. And nothing changed between us. Occasional messages. Short calls. Formal check-ins that felt more like obligations than connection. They still thought I was struggling. Still believed I had settled into something small. Something insignificant. Something disappointing. And I let them believe it. At first because it was easier. Then because I wanted to see how far it would go. How long they would hold on to that version of me. How deeply they had decided who I was. Without ever asking. I visited rarely. And when I did, I wore the same simplicity. Spoke the same way. Gave them nothing that would challenge their assumptions. They never asked deeper questions. Never looked closer. Never wondered why I was never truly affected. And that told me everything. Because if they had looked, really looked, they might have noticed. The absence of panic. The absence of desperation. The quiet certainty beneath everything I said. But they didn't. They saw what they expected to see. And nothing more. And while the world chased the identity behind that name, I sat alone in my small apartment, still wearing cheap clothes, still invisible to the only people who ever mattered. My family. 4 years, that word had felt distant. Not because they had disappeared from my life, but because I had learned to exist without expecting anything from them. No approval. No understanding. No warmth. Just distance, carefully maintained on both sides. And then, 10 years later, something shifted. It arrived as something simple. An invitation. It came in the form my mother always preferred. Elegant, understated, intentional. Thick cream paper, embossed lettering, the kind of detail that signaled importance without needing to announce it. Celebrating 45 years, Laurent and Vivienne Moreau. Below it, in smaller script, your presence would mean a great deal. I stared at that line longer than I expected. Because I knew it wasn't entirely true. My presence had never meant anything significant in that house. Not really. So, I kept reading. The date. The time. The location I already knew by heart. The house overlooking Lake Geneva, the same one where everything had started, and where everything had quietly ended. I placed the invitation down on my desk and leaned back in my chair, letting the silence of the room settle around me. 10 years. A decade of distance. A decade of building something they knew nothing about. A decade of becoming someone they had already decided I could never be. And now, this. A simple request. Come home. I almost didn't go. Not out of fear. That version of me, the one who feared their judgment, their silence, their disappointment, was long gone. What remained was something steadier, more controlled, but also more honest. And honesty has its own kind of weight. Because I knew exactly what would happen if I walked into that house again. Nothing would be different. Not at first. The same conversations. The same glances. The same careful, quiet ways of reminding me where I stood in their world. The subtle insults. The comparisons. The quiet humiliation dressed as concern. I could already hear Camille's voice in my head. Soft. Controlled. Precise. So, Elena, what have you been doing all this time? Not because she didn't know, but because she assumed the answer didn't matter. And my father? He would nod politely, listen just enough to maintain civility, then redirect the conversation to something more relevant, more successful, more aligned with what he understood. My mother would try, in her own way. She always did. But her version of care had never reached the places where I needed it most. It stayed on the surface. Safe. Contained. Distant. I knew all of this. I understood it completely. So why go back? I asked myself that question more than once. Why reopen something that had already settled into silence? Why step into a space that had never truly been mine? Why risk feeling anything at all? The answer didn't come immediately. It didn't come logically. It came quietly, like something rising from beneath everything I had built over the years. A whisper. Go. Not for revenge. That part of me, the one that once imagined proving them wrong, watching their expressions change, forcing them to see me differently, had faded. Revenge requires emotional investment, and I had spent too many years learning how to let go. Not for validation. I didn't need their approval anymore. I had built something real. Something undeniable. Something that existed whether they acknowledged it or not. Their recognition wouldn't change that. Their acceptance wouldn't define it. So it wasn't about that either. It was something else. Something quieter. More difficult to admit. Closure. Not the kind that comes from confrontation. Not the kind that comes from dramatic revelations, but the kind that comes from standing in the same place that once defined you, and realizing it no longer does. I wanted to see it for myself, to walk back into that house and feel nothing, or maybe feel everything, and know it no longer had power over me, because for years, I had moved forward without looking back. And maybe it was time to look back once, just once. And then leave it behind completely. I picked up the invitation again, running my fingers along the embossed lettering. 45 years. A lifetime of consistency, of structure, of choices that made sense to them. And somewhere in that lifetime, I had been the exception, the deviation, the one variable they couldn't control. I wondered if they ever thought about that, if they ever questioned it. Or if they had simply accepted it the way they accepted everything else, quietly, efficiently, without needing to understand. My phone buzzed softly on the desk. A message. Not from them. From someone who existed in a completely different world. The article is finalized. Scheduled for release tomorrow morning. I stared at the message for a moment. Then opened the preview. My face looked back at me from the screen. Clear. Unmistakable. Accompanied by a headline that felt almost detached from who I used to be. Something larger. Something public. Something impossible to ignore. 4 years, I had remained hidden by choice. Invisible. Untouchable. But that was about to change. Not because I needed it, but because the work had reached a point where anonymity was no longer sustainable. The scale, the impact, the attention, it demanded a presence. And I had agreed, carefully, strategically, on my terms. The timing, however, that was something else. Because the article wouldn't just exist in isolation. It would reach everyone, including them. By morning, they would know. Not through me, not through explanation, but through something undeniable. Something they couldn't dismiss. Something that didn't ask for their approval. I leaned back again, closing my eyes briefly as the realization settled in. 2 events. One night. One truth. Colliding. The invitation in my hand. The article on my screen. The past and the present. Meeting in a way I hadn't planned, but couldn't ignore. I let out a slow breath. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to anticipation. Not excitement. Not anxiety. Just awareness. That something was about to shift. Not in the world. That had already happened. But in something smaller. More personal. More fragile. The space between who I had been and who they thought I still was. I stood up slowly, walking toward the window. Berlin stretched out beneath me, familiar in a way Geneva never had been. This city had seen me at my lowest, my weakest, my most uncertain, and it had asked nothing from me in return. No expectations, no judgment, just space. I wondered what it would feel like to return to a place that had defined me before I understood myself. To stand in those rooms again. To hear those voices. To see those faces. And to know, with complete certainty, that I no longer belonged to that version of my life. I turned back toward the desk, picking up the invitation one last time. Then I reached for my phone and typed a single message. I'll be there. Simple. Neutral. Final. Because the truth was already set in motion. And by morning, the world would know my name. The dinner was exactly as I remembered. Nothing had changed. Not the house. Not the atmosphere. Not the carefully constructed illusion of perfection that lived in every polished surface and measured gesture. Crystal glasses reflected the warm chandelier light. Silverware aligned with surgical precision. Conversations floated lightly through the room, controlled and curated, each word chosen not just to communicate, but to impress. It was all so familiar. And yet, as I stepped inside, something felt different. Not in them. In me. I noticed it immediately. The way I stood. The way I breathed. The way the room no longer pressed against me the way it used to. Years ago, walking into this house felt like shrinking. Tonight, I simply observed. My mother greeted me first, her expression soft but slightly strained, as if she was unsure which version of me she was supposed to interact with. "Elena," she said, kissing the air near my cheek. "I'm glad you came." "I said I would," I replied calmly. She nodded, studying my face for a moment longer than necessary, as if searching for something she couldn't quite define. My father acknowledged me with a brief glance and a nod. No warmth. No hostility. Just distance. Consistent. Predictable. And then, Camille. She stood across the room, already watching me. Of course she was. She always noticed everything. Perfect posture. Impeccable dress. Every detail of her appearance carefully controlled, as if she existed not just to be seen, but to be admired. She approached slowly, a small, polite smile forming on her lips. "Elena," she said. "Camille." We embraced lightly. No tension. No affection. Just habit. But when she pulled back, her eyes moved, quickly, efficiently, taking in everything about me. My dress. Simple. Dark. Unremarkable. My shoes. Worn, but clean. My hair. Unstyled. Practical. The same way I had always appeared. The same version of me she had already categorized years ago. And then she smiled. That smile. The one that always cut deeper than words. "So tell me, Elena," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to reach the others nearby. "Are you still living off government aid? Or have things improved?" Silence. It spread instantly, like something heavy dropping into the center of the room. Conversations paused. Glasses stilled. Eyes shifted. Some people looked down. Others looked at me. No one spoke. No one interrupted. No one defended me. No one ever did. And in that moment, I felt it again. That old, familiar pain. Not sharp. Not overwhelming. Just present. A quiet echo of something that used to define me. But something was different this time. It didn't consume me. It didn't pull me under. It just existed, like a memory I could observe without becoming. Not anger. Not shame. Just emptiness. I looked at her. Really looked at her. At the confidence in her posture. The certainty in her tone. The absolute belief that she still understood exactly who I was. And for a brief second, I almost felt something close to sadness. Not for myself. For her. Because she had no idea. None of them did. And yet, they spoke with such certainty. Such finality. As if the story had already been written. As if my role had already been decided. And I had simply continued to play it. I could have corrected her. Right then. Right there. I could have said everything. Told them who I was. What I had built. What I had become. I could have watched the shift happen in real time. The shock. The disbelief. The recalculation. But I didn't. Not yet. Because something inside me wanted to see how far this would go. How deeply rooted their assumptions were. How much of this was real. So I answered simply. "I'm managing," I said. My voice was steady. Neutral. Controlled. Exactly what they expected. Camille tilted her head slightly, her smile widening just enough to signal satisfaction. "I'm glad to hear that," she said. "Stability is important. Especially at our age." A few quiet nods around the room. Agreement. Polite. Empty. The conversation began to move again, slowly at first, then more naturally, as if nothing had happened. As if this was normal. As if it had always been normal. I took a glass from a passing tray, more out of habit than desire, and moved slightly away from the center of the room. No one stopped me. No one followed. And that, more than anything, told me everything I needed to know. To them. Nothing had changed. I was still the same person I had always been. The one who didn't quite succeed. The one who didn't quite belong. The one they could quietly dismiss without consequence. I stood near the edge of the room, watching. Listening. Observing. The conversations were exactly what I remembered. Achievements. Investments. Properties. Names dropped like currency. Value measured in visible success. In things that could be seen. Quantified. Displayed. I wondered briefly what they would say if they knew. If they understood that the systems protecting their wealth, their data, their entire world, were built by the person they had just dismissed. The irony wasn't satisfying. It was distant. Like watching a pattern repeat itself exactly as expected. Dinner was announced soon after. We moved into the dining room, each person taking their assigned place. Of course, Camille sat close to our parents. And I, at the far end. Nothing had changed. I sat down quietly, placing my hands in my lap, feeling the weight of the moment settle, not heavily, but clearly. Defined. Precise. This was the last time I would sit here like this. Not because I wouldn't return, but because this version of the story was ending. Courses were served. Conversations continued. Camille spoke often, effortlessly guiding attention back to herself, her achievements, her life. My father listened with interest. My mother added small comments. Everyone played their role. And I remained exactly where they expected me to be. Silent. Unremarkable. Forgettable. But beneath that stillness, everything had already changed. Because while they were speaking, while they were judging, while they were certain of who I was, time was moving forward. Quietly. Unstoppably. And somewhere beyond this room, beyond this house, beyond their understanding, something had already been released. Something they couldn't control. Something they couldn't ignore. I lifted my glass slightly, not to join a toast, but simply to feel its weight in my hand. Grounding. Real. And for the first time that night, a thought surfaced, clear and steady. Just a little longer. Because the truth wasn't something I needed to force. It was already on its way. And soon, they wouldn't be able to look at me the same way again. Before I could answer, a staff member entered the room, holding a magazine. Delivery for Miss Moreau. The room barely reacted. Deliveries happened. Things arrived. Life, in this house, moved according to schedule and expectation. Until the magazine was turned around. And time stopped. My face. Clear. Unmistakable. Looking back at them with the same calm expression I had worn in that interview. Controlled, composed, distant. And beneath it, in bold lettering that demanded attention, the most elusive billionaire in Europe finally revealed. No one spoke. No one breathed. The silence this time was different. Not polite. Not controlled. It was absolute. Camille's smile collapsed. Not slowly. Not gracefully. It disappeared like something fragile that had never been meant to last under pressure. Her eyes moved rapidly between the magazine and my face, as if trying to reconcile two completely incompatible realities. My father's glass trembled in his hand, the faint clink of crystal against his ring the only sound in the room. He didn't put it down. He didn't lift it. He simply held it there, suspended, as if movement itself had become uncertain. My mother. She looked at me like she was seeing a stranger. Not with confusion alone, but with something deeper. Disorientation. As if the foundation of something she had always believed in had just shifted beneath her feet. And for the first time in my life, they were silent. Not because they didn't know what to say, but because they finally realized they had never known me at all. I reached out and took the magazine calmly, my fingers steady against the glossy surface. It felt ordinary, like nothing more than paper and ink. But the weight it carried in that room was immeasurable. It seems the timing changed, I said quietly, my voice cutting through the silence with an ease that surprised even me. This wasn't supposed to arrive until tomorrow. No one responded immediately, because they were still looking, still processing, still trying to understand how the person sitting at the end of the table, the one they had dismissed just moments ago, could be the same person staring back at them from that cover. Is this? My father began, his voice unsteady in a way I had never heard before. Elena, what is this? I met his gaze. Directly. Without hesitation. I built it, I said simply. All of it. Another silence. Shorter this time. Sharper. Camille let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but it broke halfway through. That's not possible, she said, though her voice lacked the certainty it once held. This company. This has been all over the financial world for years. No one knows who's behind it. I know, I replied. Her eyes snapped back to mine. And in that moment, something shifted. Not just in her. In the entire room. Because the pieces were beginning to align. The name. The anonymity. The timing. The absence of information. You're saying, she started, her voice tightening. You're saying that you are? Yes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I am. The words settled into the room like something irreversible. My father finally placed his glass down, though his hand lingered on it, as if he needed the contact to steady himself. "That's billions," he said slowly. "That valuation, the projections." His mind was already moving, calculating, reframing, understanding the magnitude not as a personal truth, but as a measurable reality. My mother, however, hadn't moved. Her eyes remained fixed on me, searching, not for numbers, not for explanations, but for something familiar, something she recognized. "Elena," she said softly, "why didn't you tell us?" It was the question I had expected, the one that sounded simple, but carried years of unspoken history. I held her gaze. "Would you have believed me?" She didn't answer, because she knew. I turned slightly, letting my eyes move across the table, across every face, every expression: shock, disbelief, curiosity, and something else, something quieter, recalculation, because now they were looking at me differently, not as the person they had defined for years, but as something else, something valuable. And that change, that instant shift in perception, was more revealing than anything they could have said. "I tried to tell you once," I continued, my voice still calm, "about what I found, about what I was building. You all remember that." My father looked down. My mother's expression tightened. Camille didn't move. "You called it paranoia," I said, glancing at her briefly. "A waste of potential." Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. "I didn't correct you after that," I went on. "Not when you assumed I failed. Not when you believed I needed help. Not even when you—" I paused, just slightly, made comments like the one earlier. The weight of that reference hung in the air. Sharp. Unavoidable. "I let you believe it," I said, "because I wanted to see something." "What?" Camille asked, her voice quieter now. "How much of what you thought about me was based on truth?" Silence again. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was heavy, reflective, because the answer was becoming clear. None of it had been based on truth. Only assumption, only perception, only expectation. My father cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat. "This changes things," he said. I almost smiled. Of course it did. Not who I was, not what I had done, but how they saw me. That had changed instantly, completely, effortlessly. And that was the most painful truth of all. "Does it?" I asked quietly. He hesitated, because he understood the question, understood what it implied. And for once, he didn't have an immediate answer. Camille leaned back slightly, her composure slowly reconstructing itself, piece by piece. "That's impressive," she said carefully. "Truly. I mean, no one expected." "No," I interrupted gently. "You didn't." Our eyes met, and for the first time, there was no superiority in hers, no certainty, just something unfamiliar, unsteady. "I'm still the same person I was when I walked in," I said. "Nothing about me changed tonight." No one disagreed, because they couldn't. "The only thing that changed," I continued, "is what you know." The room felt smaller now, not physically, but emotionally, like something had been exposed that couldn't be hidden again. My mother's voice came softer this time. "We were wrong," she said. "It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. And for a moment, that mattered. But only a moment. Because the past didn't disappear with a single sentence. It didn't undo years of distance. Years of silence. Years of being unseen." I nodded once, acknowledging it, but not absorbing it, because I didn't need it anymore. And that was the difference. I stood slowly, placing the magazine back on the table, turning it slightly so it faced all of them. Not as a statement. Not as a victory. Just as truth. I should go, I said. No one stopped me. Not immediately. Because they were still adjusting. Still recalibrating. Still trying to understand how to exist in this new version of reality. And I understood something in that moment. This wasn't an ending. It was a fracture. The moment everything broke. Not dramatically. Not loudly. But permanently. Because once you see the truth, you can't return to the illusion. I turned and walked toward the door, my steps steady, my mind quiet. And as I reached it, I realized something unexpected. This wasn't the moment I proved them wrong. It wasn't the moment I won. It wasn't even the moment they finally saw me. It was something else entirely. It was the moment I no longer needed them to.